It's my great pleasure to introduce Colin Raffel, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He also spends one day a week as a staff research scientist at Google Brain. He obtained his PhD in electrical engineering from Columbia University in 2016 under the supervision of Daniel Ellis. Today, he's going to be telling us about T5 and large language models, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So Colin, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. So let me just go ahead and kind of give you an overview of what I'll be covering today. This is kind of a talk that covers 5 papers, which is a bit ambitious for a 50-minute talk, but we'll see how we do. And these papers kind of in turn answer these questions. So the first question is basically what transfer learning methods work best. It's kind of an empirical survey of the field to get everyone familiar with the subject that I'll be discussing today. And then what happens when we scale the things that work best to larger and larger models. The next question pertains to multilingual models. So most of the time when people train machine learning models for NLP, they focus on English, but we'll be talking a bit about training models that support over 100 languages. And then we'll kind of try to answer what kind of knowledge, what information do these models actually pick up when you perform the unsupervised pre-training stage at the beginning of the transfer learning pipeline. And then a related question is, do these models actually just memorize training data? And if so, can we get the model to spit it back out? And finally, at the end, I'll present some super recent work that showed up on arXiv less than a month ago that basically tries to evaluate, rather than what transfer learning methods work best, which sort of transformer architectures work best. And I know this is probably a talk with attendees with varied backgrounds, and maybe some of the terms that I introduced, like transfer learning, transformer, et cetera, may not be super familiar. But hopefully over the course of the talk, you'll get a good sense of these different topics. And also, if anything's confusing, then feel free to either ping the chat or unmute and ask me a question, because if you're confused about something, you're probably not the only one. So great. So let me just kind of give you the high level picture of transfer learning, which is kind of the main technique that I'm going to be discussing today. So in transfer learning, especially in natural language processing, the pipeline looks a bit like this. So the first thing we do is we take a big collection of unlabeled text data. Maybe we scraped a bunch of text off the internet, maybe we took Wikipedia, but it doesn't really matter, just a large corpus of unlabeled text data. And we apply some kind of unsupervised objective to it. So in practice, one common thing to do is to take the text data and randomly remove words. And then we now basically have an objective to train our model with, which is to fill in the missing words. And it turns out that doing these kind of unsupervised objectives, and it's unsupervised in the sense that a human didn't come along and actually provide labels, we just took unlabeled data and made up an objective by removing words and training to predict the missing words. Doing this pre-training can actually be really beneficial as a first step before you actually use the model on a task you care about. So we do this pre-training stage, and it kind of maybe gives the model the idea of what different words mean, maybe, as we'll talk about later, gives the model some quote unquote world knowledge. And the model can then make use of that information when it's fine-tuned on a downstream task. And so when I say fine-tuned, I mean we take the pre-trained model, we copy its parameters, and we just train it on a task that we actually care about. And usually we call that task the downstream task. So in this example, I'm showing a sentiment analysis task. So we feed the model a movie review shown in blue there, and we're training the model to predict that the movie review is negative. So this is one of those simple canonical NLP problems. And again, it turns out that by doing this unsupervised pre-training task first, the model can actually typically get much better performance when fine-tuned than if you had skipped the pre-training step. And it also tends to converge to a good model much more quickly. So transfer learning for NLP has kind of gone through a number of stages in the past, let's say, 10 years or so. And before 2014, the dominant sort of method for a style of transfer learning in NLP were word vectors. I won't talk about word vectors too much today, except to say that that was kind of what people did before the current paradigm that I just described. And that paradigm where you pre-train the entire model, copy it, and fine-tune it, most people think was introduced in this paper from 2015 called Semi-Supervised Sequence Learning. And that paper didn't make a huge splash. People, kind of kept using word vectors. And it wasn't really until 2018 or so when a string of papers, the Universal Language Model Fine-Tuning paper, the Elmo paper, the first GPT paper, the GPT-1 paper, and finally at the end of 2018, the BERT paper, these kind of clued people in that this is actually a very, very powerful recipe, that this pre-training step is really beneficial. And that got people really excited. And when people are excited, they write papers. And in 2019 in particular, there was just really an onslaught of papers developing new transfer learning methods. So proposing new pre-training data sets, new pre-training objectives, new model architectures, et cetera, to make transfer learning work as well as possible. So the point is that kind of in this span of time, this year and a half, a lot of stuff happened. And the tricky thing about when there's a lot of excitement and a lot of papers coming out at the same time is you get into situations like this. So let's say that paper A proposes some sort of new unsupervised pre-training objective. They call it fancy learn. Paper B proposes another pre-training objective. They call it fancier learn. And the paper B with fancier learn achieves better results. But paper A, pre-trained on Wikipedia, and paper B, pre-trained on Wikipedia and let's say a corpus of books, of novels. So then the question is fancier learn actually better than fancy learn, or did it just get better performance because it used a different pre-training data set? Similarly, let's say that paper A uses a smaller model than paper B, or paper A pre-trains on less data than paper B, or maybe paper A uses a different optimizer to train the model. And ultimately, the difficulty with all of those situations is that you basically just have confounding experimental factors, and it gets hard to know what actually works best, which method is actually the best. And so around, somewhere in 2019, we started trying to kind of take a step back and say, let's look at all the stuff that people have proposed, and let's try to figure out what works best. So we're not going to propose any new methods. We're just going to kind of survey the current landscape, evaluate everything in a unified experimental setting, and evaluate what actually works best. And then given what works best, let's scale things up. Let's train models for longer, train bigger models, and see how far we can push the limits of the field. And so now I'll talk about that paper, which is called Exploring the Limits of Transfer Learning with a Unified Text-to-Text Transformer. So the text-to-text transformer is the model that we come up with at the end of the paper, which is kind of our take on the best of the best. We call it T5 because there's 5 T's in the name of the model. And the main idea behind T5, and one of the things that allows us to do this empirical survey with a unified experimental setting, is this idea of casting all text-based NLP problems in exactly the same format. And that format is what we would call a text-to-text format, or a sequence-to-sequence format. And the basic idea is that we feed the model some text and we train it to predict text. So for machine translation, this is very natural. We feed the model some English sentence and we train the model to predict the German sentence. This is kind of the classic sequence-to-sequence setting. But we go a little further and we actually cast all kinds of problems as text-to-text problems. Like, for example, this task, which is the corpus of linguistic acceptability, that's COLA. And in COLA, you feed the model a sentence and the model has to perform a classification as to whether the sentence is acceptable or not, which basically means, is it grammatically correct and is it nonsensical? This sentence, the course is jumping well, is nonsensical, so the model should predict that the sentence is not acceptable. But rather than producing a discrete class label, we actually just predict the text not acceptable, the literal string that has the semantic meaning of the class that we're trying to predict. So now we have sequence-to-sequence problems and classification problems under our belt. We can also do regression. So in regression, let's say we're given 2 sentences. This is the STSB task. And we have to predict a floating point value that denotes how similar those two sentences are. Now, floating point values and strings are quite different, but you can convert from a floating point value to a string pretty easily. You just turn 3.8 into the string 3.8, and you train the model to predict that string. Of course, we also do a little bit of quantization because we don't want the model to have arbitrary precision. And it turns out that on many problems, not having arbitrary precision doesn't hurt you very much. And on this particular benchmark, we ultimately got state-of-the-art results. And, again, this really applies to all kinds of NLP problems. For example, abstractive summarization, where you're fed let's say a news article and you have to output a short summary of it. And again, the point is that this framework allows us to tackle all of these problems with exactly the same format. And by using the same format, we actually can use exactly the same objective and exactly the same set of parameters. We don't need to add separate classification heads. We don't need to use different objectives. We are just always using standard maximum likelihood cross entropy loss for all of these problems. And one thing that I've neglected to mention so far is that you probably saw that whenever I was feeding tasks into the model, on the left, I was prepending these little, actually, can everyone see my cursor? Great. So you can see that we feed in these, what we call task prefixes. And the reason we feed in task prefixes is because we will be experimenting with training the model on multiple tasks at once. And if you just feed the model a sentence, it doesn't know what you want it to do with it. So these task prefixes are just telling the model, okay, I want you to classify whether the input sentence is acceptable or not, or I want you to translate the input sentence to German, and so on. So this is kind of our text-to-text framework. The next big question when we're going to undertake a study like this is what model should we use? And we use the transformer architecture, which is basically now the de facto model architecture for NLP problems. And the transformer architecture is built up of a series of what we call self-attention layers, feed-forward layers, and normalization layers. And in our case, the architecture that we use actually kind of has two components, one that we call the encoder and one that we call the decoder. The encoder's job is to transform the input into some learned representation. And then the decoder's job is to output text one token at a time, which you can think of like words, kind of like one word at a time, while it looks back on the input to help it to figure out what it should output. I won't go into a ton of more detail about what the transformer is, but there are lots of really excellent tutorials online that describe the transformer architecture, like the one linked on the screen here. So then the next question is, what data are we going to pre-train the model on? And the nice thing about transfer learning for NLP is there's actually tons and tons of text out there. We have the internet, people are typing into the internet all the time. And so there's lots of sources of data that we can use to pre-train these models. And one source would be Wikipedia, which I'm showing here. These are all various articles from Wikipedia. As part of our study, we actually wanted to study the impact of different pre-training data sets. And so we wanted kind of a canonical pre-training data set that we can modify in different ways to measure how those modifications impact downstream task performance. So we created a new data set that starts from web extracted text from Common Crawl. So Common Crawl is a kind of public nonprofit web crawl. They just send spiders out on the web and download as much HTML as they can. And then they have a service that tries to extract text out of the HTML. So removing all of the tags and whatnot. And what you get out of that looks something vaguely like this. And overall, you get a lot of natural text out of the web extracted text files. But you can see that there's some duplication across pages. For example, this paragraph and this paragraph are duplicated. There's a lot of boilerplate text, like menu text, section headings. Sometimes you get stuff that kind of looks like code. It's not natural text. Maybe you get some placeholder text. So we just implemented kind of a series of simple heuristics that I won't go into in a lot of detail to kind of try to get rid of some of that content. So we remove any line that doesn't end in a terminal punctuation mark. We deduplicate sentences. We remove anything that looks like placeholder text or code. And we actually get reasonably natural looking text using a pretty simple pipeline for cleaning the data. This produced a data set that we call C4, the Colossal Clean Crawl Corpus. And C4 is publicly available in TensorFlow datasets. And actually, as of recently, the Allen Institute has started hosting it. So you can just immediately load the dataset and start messing around with it if you want. Okay, so we have our objective, our framework. We have our model architecture, we have our pre-training data set, and now we need our pre-training objective. So how are we going to take that unlabeled text data and learn from it? And we're going to do something pretty similar to what I described at the beginning of the talk. We'll take some input text like, thank you for inviting me to your party last week, which is just, let's say, a sentence of text on the internet somewhere. We're going to randomly choose tokens, which again, in our case, you can think of tokens like words. So we'll randomly choose words and we'll remove some of them. We'll mark some of them for deletion. And then any consecutive span of words that have been marked for deletion, we replace with a sentinel token. So these are basically like just telling the model that it should fill in the blank right here. And then we train the model to fill in the blanks and delimit by sentinel tokens. So we train the model to output the missing words from the input. And that's really all there is to it. So just to be a little more specific about the transfer learning pipeline that we used, we pre-train our model with this denoising objective that I just described. We call it denoising because you're kind of applying noise to the input by corrupting it. And we're pre-training it over the C4 data set. If you're familiar, the model size that we used is kind of has a overall similar size to BERT base in the encoder and the decoder. But if you're not familiar with that, that's all just to say that it's kind of a typical size for these type of models at the time. And we pre-train it for about 34 billion tokens of data, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually not very much. It's actually a quarter as long as BERT, and I think a 64th as long as Roberta, if you're familiar with those models. This is all to say that it's not a ton of pre-training, but it's enough pre-training that we can get a sense of what works and doesn't work without expending tons of compute on every single experiment that we run. And then we fine-tune it on a bunch of downstream tasks. So we fine-tune it on the GLUE benchmark, which is kind of a collection of tasks that are mostly classification tasks that try to measure the model's generic natural language understanding abilities. The CNN Daily Mail abstractive summarization corpus, which again, you feed in a news article, you output a summary. The SQUAD question answering data set. So this is a reading comprehension task. You get a paragraph and a question about the paragraph. You have to output the answer. SuperGLUE, which is like a more difficult version of GLUE, but otherwise is pretty similar. And then 3 translation tasks. So these are English to German, English to French, and English to Romanian translation tasks that people use in the literature. And so on each of these tasks, we fine tune for actually about half as long as we pre-trained, and then we pick the best checkpoint and report the best validation performance. So this is kind of our basic recipe. And in this paper, what we basically did is we took this recipe and we modified one little piece at a time and measured the impact. And in doing so, by kind of measuring different choices people have made in different papers, we can really compare things in a common setting. And I won't go into a ton of detail into all the individual results we got. There's many tables with many numbers, and I don't really have the time to go through all of them, but if you're interested in any of the nitty-gritty details, you can refer to the paper itself. But I'll just give you kind of a high-level overview of the results now. So the first kind of experimental factor that we investigated were different model architectures. So I mentioned earlier that our model uses an encoder-decoder architecture. The encoder learns a representation of the input sequence, the decoder conditions on that and outputs the output. There are other model architectures people have commonly used for pre-trained language models. One is kind of a standard causal left to right language model. If you're familiar with GPT-2 and 3, those models have this architecture. The basic idea is that the model is just trained to predict the next token given the tokens that came before it. And if you have a text-to-text format where you actually have explicit inputs and outputs, you just concatenate them. And then once the model has predicted the end of the inputs, it just starts predicting the output. And this is, this format was popularized by GPT-2. There's an alternative to that, though, which is what we call the prefix LM. And in the prefix LM, you basically allow the model to have full visibility on the input before it starts outputting anything in the target. It's a small detail, but it actually can make a significant performance in practice. And ultimately what we found was that for our text-to-text format, it was most performant to use an encoder-decoder architecture. The next thing we experimented with was the pre-training objective. So there are kind of a couple of high-level objectives you could use. One is the BERT style objective that which is kind of this masking out words approach that I've been talking about so far. But you could also imagine instead of masking out missing words, you are given a prefix and you have to start predicting what comes after it. And that's kind of a standard language modeling objective, and that's very commonly used as a pre-training objective. You also could imagine that we take the text, we shuffle it, and we have to train the model to unshuffle the text. It turns out that this masked language modeling, this denoising objective where we drop out words and we fill in the blanks, that's what works best in our setting. And so we kind of chose that and then explored different strategies for corrupting the text. So, should we replace spans like we were doing so far? Should we just completely drop tokens so that basically you just choose words and remove them completely from the input and train the model to generate all the missing words? It turned out that having it replace spans worked quite well, but then there are additional questions like what percentage of the tokens should I drop out? And if I'm going to drop out explicit spans of text, how long should those spans be? We experimented with that too. The next thing we looked into were different pre-training data sets. So we included C4, which was kind of our baseline. We also included a variant of C4 that had no cleaning. So we just took the raw web extracted text and pre-trained the model on that. We took a data set of news that was inspired by the real news data set from the Grover paper. We used a data set containing only text from links from Reddit, which is what GPT-2 and 3 used. It's kind of, people call it the web text data set. And finally, we included this kind of data set that comprises Wikipedia and the Toronto Books Corpus, which is just text from Wikipedia articles and text from novels, which was what was used in BERT. And it turns out that actually you can get better performance on certain tasks by using a data set other than C4. For example, if you use the news data, you get better performance on record. And record is a reading comprehension benchmark on news data. It's you feed the model a news article and you ask it a question about the article. And so if you pre-train on news data, you can do better on a news-focused task, which shouldn't be terribly surprising. And similarly, if you pre-train on novel text, you do better on multi-RC, which uses text from novels and so on. So the point is that, and this is kind of well known now, it wasn't as well known when we published the paper, but if you do kind of what we call in-domain pre-training, it can benefit you on a domain-specific downstream task. So that kind of seems like, okay, maybe we should actually do domain-specific pre-training. The problem is that if you constrain yourself to a specific domain, like news, for example, you have much less data. And what we also showed in the paper is that once the size of the pre-training data set gets small enough that the model can start to overfit on it, you then get a bad performance on the downstream task. So it is also important to have enough data that you don't overfit. So the next set of things we looked into was multitask learning, as I mentioned earlier. In multitask learning, rather than pre-training model and then individually and separately fine-tuning it on every downstream task, we try to train one model that can perform many tasks at once. So this diagram on the left here kind of illustrates the standard pre-train then fine-tune on separate tasks paradigm. But you could also just imagine that we mix all of the data from all the tasks together and train on them all at once. And we could do that including the unsupervised task, where we sample from the unsupervised task at some ratio and then sample from the other tasks at some other rate. And it turns out that, at least in our experiments, it was very hard to match the performance of individual task fine-tuning when doing multitask training. And this is actually a pretty well-known result that basically the model really needs a ton of capacity if it's going to be able to do lots of tasks at once. So an alternative that we explored was to do multitask pre-training followed by individual task fine-tuning. And it turns out that as long as you do the individual task fine-tuning, you can actually match the performance of the unsupervised pre-training followed by individual task fine-tuning. And the benefit of this setting is that you can track the performance on all of your downstream tasks over the course of pre-training. You don't have to wait till pre-training is done and you fine-tune in order to get a sense of the performance. So the last thing we experimented with was scale. So basically, the premise of these experiments is if someone comes along and gives you 4 times as much compute, what should you do with it? Should you train for 4 times longer? Should you make the model 4 times bigger? Should you train 4 models and ensemble them? And it turns out that training for longer and training a bigger model are both quite helpful. You can get improvements from either of those two things. Training an ensemble is also helpful, but not quite as helpful as just training bigger models for longer. So we took all of the results from all the experiments I just described, and even some more that I didn't have time to mention. And like I said, we kind of just chose what worked best for our final model. We are going to use an encoder-decoder architecture. We'll use the span corruption objective on the C4 data set because we don't want to overfit to the pre-training data when we scale up the pre-training length. We're going to do the multitask pre-training because, again, it allows us to monitor the downstream task performance during pre-training. And finally, of course, we will train bigger models for longer. And specifically, we trained 5 model size variants. We call them small base, large 3B, and 11B, ranging from 60 million to 11 billion parameters. And at the time, 11 billion parameters was really quite a lot larger than the models that people have typically trained here. So we really were exploring the limits in terms of scale. And in terms of pre-training length, as I mentioned before, we trained for about 34 billion tokens. And now we're going to pre-train for 1 trillion tokens. And actually, C4 is big enough that when you pre-train for 1 trillion tokens, you only really go through the data set roughly 1 time. So that's about how big C4 is. And ultimately, we were really pleased with the results. So on the GLUE benchmark, we got state-of-the-art results by a decent margin. Same thing on the CNN Daily Mail task, on Squad as well. On all of these tasks, if you look at these numbers in the absolute versus the previous best in our score, they look pretty small. In machine learning benchmarks, sometimes it's, I guess I'll just say, sometimes it's very hard to make even a small amount of progress. And in particular on Squad, most of the time when people would outperform the previous best, it would be by maybe 0.1% or 0.2%. But in our case, we outperformed the previous best by over 1 percentage point, which again, maybe doesn't sound that exciting, but it was to us. On Superglue specifically, we were especially excited though, because we had this big bump in performance and actually got very close to the human level performance on the task. And Superglue was actually a benchmark that was specifically designed to be hard for existing models and very easy for humans. And not too long after Superglue was proposed, we basically closed the gap between model and human performance. Now, on the translation tasks, the results weren't so exciting. We actually didn't get state-of-the-art results on any of those tasks. And the reason we think this is because most of the state-of-the-art results in translation use a method called back translation, where you use unlabeled data and have the model translate the data into the target language and back. And it kind of gives you a self-training or data augmentation style technique to leverage unlabeled data that is task specific and seems to work a lot better than just unsupervised pre-training like we're doing. So we release all of the models that we trained in this paper. You can find our code for this paper at this GitHub repo. And actually, there is also a nice Colab, which is like a Jupyter notebook, like an interactive Python, interactive and descriptive Python code that's hosted in the browser. So you can actually fine tune our models for free in your browser using the URL at the bottom of the page here. Cool. So great. We trained a really wonderful English-only model. What about all the other languages? There are lots of languages that people speak other than English. So in this next paper, we tried to address that issue. And we introduced a model that we call MT5 for multilingual T5. And if there's one thing you need to know about MT5 is that it's basically T5, but it's pre-trained on 100 languages instead of 1. And as a result, it can perform tasks quite well in many, many different languages. So the biggest question here is, where are we going to get that multilingual data? Well, we're basically going to take even more data from Common Crawl. We're going to run it through a decent language detector, and we're going to collect as much data as we can in about 100 languages. So what languages did we get? The most prevalent language, of course, is English. There were about 3 trillion tokens of English in the MC4 data set. and the least is Yoruba. There are only about 50 million tokens in Yoruba. And one thing you can do when you have this huge disparity between the most common language and the least common language is you can kind of reweight languages by raising the sampling proportion for each language to some floating point value, usually less than 1. And what you can think of us doing here is that as this value gets closer and closer to 0, we're basically sampling with uniform probability across languages rather than sampling according to how many actual documents there are in each language. The purely proportional setting is as if we just concatenated all the languages into one big data set and we're sampling randomly. And there's a trade-off here. So if you, as you make this alpha hyperparameter smaller, you end up doing better and better on the low resource languages. And as you make it larger, you do better and better on the high resource languages. So there is a trade-off here. You kind of have to pick a value that gives good performance on low and high resource languages. So we evaluated on the extreme benchmark, which is kind of like GLUE, but for multilingual tasks. And again, we were very pleased with the results and achieved state-of-the-art results in 2 of the settings. In 2 of the other settings, they weren't really a good fit for the text-to-text framework. These are settings that are basically sequence labeling tasks, like if you're familiar, like named entity recognition. And we didn't really spend enough time casting those problems into the text-to-text format, and ultimately didn't submit a model in those settings. One thing that we found that was interesting was that as you scaled up, of course, as you scale up the model tends to perform better. But in extreme, they kind of consider a couple different settings as far as what training data is available. There's the kind of simplest setting where you just have fine-tuning data in the language that you want to fine-tune on, like ground truth data. That's what they call in-language multitask. There's also translate train, which means I took English fine-tuning data and I fed it through a machine translation system to get the target language. And then finally, there's zero shot, which is that I've fine-tuned the model only on English, and I'm just going to feed it some text in another language that it's never seen before during fine-tuning and see how well it performs. And one thing that was surprising to us here is that the gap between the zero shot performance, for example, for the largest and smallest model was much, much, much bigger than for the in-language multitask, kind of like the simplest setting. So this kind of suggests that the ability, the sort of cross-lingual ability, gets even better as the model scales up. Maybe because the model has more capacity to represent kind of semantics in every possible language. Cool. So on that note, as we scale these models up, how can we know what kind of knowledge and how much knowledge the model actually picks up during pre-training? And to answer this question, we will focus on the problem of question answering. And in the standard formulation for question answering is the reading comprehension task, which I mentioned earlier. You feed the model a paragraph, a question about the paragraph, the model has to extract the answer from the paragraph. A harder version of this problem is what people call open domain question answering. And here you feed the model a question, the model has access to a bunch of paragraphs. It has to find the right paragraph and extract the answer from it. So this is kind of like the setting where you ask me a question, I Google it, I find the Wikipedia article, and I copy and paste it and send it back to you. So I have to have access to Wikipedia, otherwise I have no idea what the answer was. We introduce a harder still variant of this problem that we call closed book question answering, which is kind of like a pub quiz or a closed book exam, where you just ask the model the question and it has to try to output the answer without looking up any external knowledge. So why would we ever expect it to be able to do this? So as a reminder, when we pre-train T5, we feed in sentences or chunks of text where words have been masked out randomly. For example, we might feed in President Franklin blank born blank January 1882, and the model has to fill in D. Roosevelt was blank in. Now, if you do that during pre-training, what you might hope is that the model has kind of internalized the knowledge of Franklin D. Roosevelt's birthday. So if during fine-tuning, or actually at inference time, we ask the model, when was Franklin D. Roosevelt born? maybe it can think back to its pre-training and kind of look into the knowledge that it has internalized and answer the question correctly. So this kind of gives us a way to measure, as long as we ask it questions that we didn't fine tune it on, it gives us a way to measure whether the model has, like how much knowledge the model has picked up during pre-training. So what we did is we took standard open domain question answering benchmarks. We converted them to the closed book format just by getting rid of all of the external knowledge that was available. And we evaluated T5, actually a later version called T5.1.1, where the main difference is just that we only pre-trained this model on unlabeled text data. We didn't do the multitask pre-training. The reason we do that is because maybe the fact that we pre-trained on a multitask mixture, including squad, which is a question answering task, that might have benefited us. So we experimented with T5.1.1, and we found the results were pretty decent. It wasn't near the state of the art for a model that explicitly retrieves information, but it wasn't too far off either. And of course, the model's performance also scales as the model gets bigger, maybe because the model is picking up more knowledge during pre-training. Now, we were kind of brainstorming, well, how can we make this work better? And one thing we tried was inspired by this paper called Realm, where you take the knowledge source, in this case, Wikipedia, and you intentionally mask out spans that are sort of relevant for knowledge. So for example, people's names, dates, etc., the kind of things that you might ask questions about, you try to mask those spans out explicitly. And we call this salient span masking. And so if you pre-train the model for longer, this x-axis is basically the amount of additional pre-training that we do on the salient span masking task. We can measure how much of a boost of performance do we get. So basically, this is the original pre-trained model here. We do continued pre-training either on span corruption or on salient span masking. And you can see that as we do more of this salient span masking pre-training in the final stages, you get a bigger and bigger and bigger boost in performance. And ultimately, we actually were able to exceed the state of the art on one of the open domain question answering data sets with our largest model combined with salient span masking. And the notable thing here again is that this model explicitly looks up information in an external knowledge source. Our model just tries to pack all of that knowledge into its parameters so that it can answer the question correctly after pre-training. Now, one thing to note that we also found was that the evaluation metrics that people use for these tasks actually kind of unfairly penalize our models. In particular, you could imagine, if I asked the model, one of our favorite examples is where are space shuttles launched in the U.S.? There are lots of answers to that question. There's Florida, Cape Canaveral, the Kennedy Launch Center, and the way that these models are typically evaluated is by comparing the model's prediction to a ground truth answer. And if the model can predict something that's totally correct, it's just a different answer than was annotated. So we went through and kind of hand annotated whether the model was correct and found that our accuracy in terms of correct predictions went up on one of the data sets from about 36% to 58%. So it could be that our model actually is better than the state of the art. It's just giving alternate kind of correct answers. So that's interesting. That's great. The model learns a lot of stuff during pre-training. But now the question is, does the model also learn some stuff? Does it memorize stuff that we don't really want it to? And this is a question that people have commented on in the past. These are two comments from two major kind of technology entities that were sent for a request for comments from the US government. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation basically said that that the extent to which that a machine learning tool will basically output if it's copyrighted is likely to be very, very small in legal language. And OpenAI similarly said that if an AI system is well constructed, they generally do not regenerate any non-trivial portion of unaltered data from a particular work in their training data set. So this is all to say that people really thought, when they made these comments, that if you pre-train a language model, it's unlikely that the model is going to just generate verbatim text from its training data. And so our goal in this work is to basically show that that's actually not the case. You can get language models to regurgitate their training data. So the way that we attack this is actually pretty simple. We took a pre-trained language model like GPT-2, and we fed in a prefix. In this case, it starts with East Stroudsburg, Stroudsburg. And we can get the model to output pretty long strings of data that only appear on a few pages on the internet. So in this case, this is actually the name, email address, phone number, fax number of an individual. And this text appears only a couple of times on the internet, but nevertheless, when fed the correct prefix, GPT-2 outputs it verbatim. So the crucial question here is, how are we going to generate prefixes, and how are we going to see if we can get the model to regurgitate anything? There are a couple of different strategies we use to generate prefixes. One was just to, sorry, I should say first that there will be a handful of ways that we generate prefixes, but we also need to decide how we're going to sample from the model. We can use different sampling strategies to decide which token to choose as the model generates each token. But then, and we can actually take samples generated from the model and feed them back into the model and get it to continue generating stuff. We can also take random internet text actually from the C4 data set, feed it into the model, and see if we can get it to output what comes next. Then we've gotten the model to generate something. We need a way to determine, or at least to help us predict whether the stuff that it generated was actually memorized text. And for this, we'll use the perplexity score, which is basically comparable. It's similar to the likelihood assigned by the model to the text. And we'll compare the perplexity that the model assigned to a given generation across different models. So we say, like, the largest GPT-2 assigns this perplexity to this generation, this continuation, and the smallest GPT-2 assigns a different perplexity. And if there's a big discrepancy there, then that might suggest to us that GPT-2, the larger version, thinks that the text is much more likely, so maybe it memorized it. We can also use a completely different model of text, like zlib, which is a compression algorithm that ultimately outputs a perplexity, and compare GPT-2's perplexity to zlib. Then we basically choose, according to these scores, the top 100 things, the things that are basically assigned the scores that suggest that they're likely to be memorized. And then we check whether they're memorized by doing an internet search. And if we find it on the internet, we ask the GPT-2 authors, was this in the training set? And they tell us yes or no. So just to give you an example of one of these sort of scoring methods, if you, in this plot, we're showing for many, many, many different samples, the perplexity assigned to a continuation by GPT-2 on the x-axis, and the perplexity assigned by zlib, or the entropy rather, on the y-axis. And you can see that most of them kind of fall into this one blob, but there are a bunch of examples where GPT-2 assigns a very low perplexity, like a suspiciously low perplexity, which might suggest, if GPT-2 is saying, oh, this is very highly probable, it might suggest that it is memorized text. And all of these big dots are points that we ultimately queried the internet to see if they existed, and then asked the GPT-2 authors if they were in the training set, and the ones that are blue were. So you can see this is a pretty decent way of trying to find memorized text. And ultimately, we found lots and lots of examples of memorized text using this approach. We found named individuals and contact info, which is PII, which is kind of private data that we don't really want models to memorize. And also a lot of other stuff that maybe is a little less surprising that the model memorized, like religious text, pseudonyms. GPT-2 was trained during Donald Trump's presidency, so lots of Donald Trump tweets. And we got lucky, and we found that there was actually one collection of text that GPT-2 memorized that all came from one document. And these were all URLs from Reddit. And the nice thing about these URLs is they all have basically the same format. It's http://reddit.com/r/a random string of numbers and letters / the thread title. And the nice thing about that is that everything up to the /r is exactly the same. And then we have a bunch of random numbers and letters, which are impossible to predict. They're random. If they're truly random, then they should be impossible to predict. And then we had the thread title. And these URLs appeared at different frequencies in this document. There were duplicates, is basically what I'm saying. And because of this, we could actually measure how many times does the URL need to appear in a document in order for a given model to memorize it? And it turned out that the largest version of GPT-2 needed to see the URL fewer times to memorize it compared to the medium and small version. And we according to this experiment, would guess that that number is somewhere between 17 and 33 times. Now, that doesn't mean that GPT-2 needs to see a given string between 17 and 33 times to memorize it, because there are other factors that matter, like, for example, how hard is the string to predict. But the notable thing here is that the medium and smaller models needed to see strings more times in order to memorize them. So this is a very long-winded way of saying that we have evidence that larger models are more prone to memorizing training data than smaller models. Okay, so now I'm going to kind of shift in a totally different direction and revisit a similar question that from our first paper. And if you remember, we didn't touch the model architecture in the first paper. We just used the transformer as it was and didn't try to improve upon the transformer in any way. And we showed that as we made that model bigger and bigger, the performance got better and better and better. What we're asking in this paper is, can we actually start to close the gap in the performance between small and large models by changing the transformer architecture? And we undertook a very similar study to the first paper, to the T5 paper, but instead of modifying transfer learning methodology, we modified the transformer architecture itself using existing proposed modifications. So just as a reminder, here's kind of a schematic of the transformer architecture. And since it was introduced in 2017, many people have tried to improve this model. They've introduced different ways of embedding the tokens before you feed them into the model, different ways of predicting at the output of the model, and different normalization schemes, different initialization schemes, different attention mechanisms, different ways of structuring the feed-forward networks, and then finally kind of architectures that deviate from this very significantly, like the funnel transformer that tries to downsample the sequence as you feed it through the model, the evolved transformer that uses a completely different block structure, and so on. There are many, many, many such modifications. And what we did is we took this big set of transformer modifications and we re-implemented them all in exactly the same code base. Just like before, we want to get rid of as many experimental factors as we can. So we re-implement everything in the same code base and we evaluated their performance. In this plot, along the x-axis, we have different transformer modifications, which I'm leaving nameless because I don't want to name any names. And the y-axis, we basically have the validation loss. So we pre-train the model on a bunch of unlabeled text data, and then we can measure the loss on a validation set of held out data. In this case, the lower, the better, as is the case with losses. And you can see, maybe you've noticed that I've put as this dashed line, the baseline performance. So this is basically just like the vanilla transformer, very close to what was originally proposed in 2017. And you can see that actually only a few modifications do better than the baseline performance. So this is kind of a nice way of saying that most of these modifications turn out to not be helpful and actually maybe harmful. So then the question is, which ones were actually helpful? Well, a bunch of them were pretty minor changes. These were like just changing the nonlinearity in the feed forward layer, for example. And then a bunch of other ones were actually resulted in models that were more expensive, either because they were bigger or they just required more flops, or they scaled up the model in some inconvenient way. And once you mark out all of the changes that were either minor or were ultimately made the model more expensive, there actually are pretty much not any improvements that beat the baseline in a significant amount. So this is just on the validation loss. I haven't talked about downstream task performance. If we measure downstream task performance, we get a pretty similar picture. So I've highlighted the same transformer modifications here, and you can see that the modifications that improve over the baseline performance tend to be the ones that are either a pretty minor change or make the model more expensive. So there are some kind of hypotheses we can make as to why our results came out this way. The first is that maybe our implementation where we implemented all of these different modifications, maybe it's unusual in some way. It's different from where these modifications were originally tested. And so we're not testing them in a kind of standard setting. We don't think this is true because the code base we used was actually written by one of the transformers authors, and it's kind of a descendant of the original transformer code base. So assuming that people are all, it's kind of based, it's very similar to the parent code base of what probably is all of subsequent code bases of the transformer. Maybe the tasks that we consider are non-standard. We don't think this is true. We experimented with a pre-training setup, but then we also just did a supervised machine translation setup, which really covers most of the tasks that were considered in the modification papers we considered. Maybe we needed to tune our hyperparameters better. To test this, we actually took one particular modification, and one of my co-authors spent a couple of weeks trying to tune hyperparameters to make it work as best as possible. They still weren't able to beat the baseline with that method. Maybe we re-implemented these things incorrectly. To test this, we actually emailed the authors of all of the modifications that we considered and asked them if our implementation was correct. All of the ones who got back to us said that it was. And the last possibility is maybe these transformer modifications don't transfer, so to speak. So if I come up with a transfer modification, I implement it in my code base with my hyperparameters on my task, maybe that modification won't transfer that well to another code base with a different implementation and hyperparameters on a different task. And if that's the case, which we think our results might suggest, we would argue it would be beneficial if people try to test their transformer modifications, or really any machine learning algorithm or architecture, on as many problems as possible and as many code bases as possible to really measure the generality of the approach. So that's my last slide. Here are the 5 papers I talked about today. And this work was done with an amazing, gigantic group of co-authors that I've listed on the screen here. And now I'm happy to take any questions you all have.